welcome to Unleash Potential, the fourth session in our life group series Unleashed. Today we're going to take a look at Acts chapter 8. This is quite a long reading, so take a look at it, read it at home, press pause on the video, and then we'll continue together as we look at the content of today's session together. In our previous session, Unleashed Presence, we read about how the apostles had been arrested, released, flogged, and told to never preach again. However, they did the complete opposite, and as a result, the apostles continued to be pursued and faced hostile opposition from religious leaders. So much so, they made false allegations against Stephen, one of the apostles. He had been arrested and then stoned to death. Here we see Saul make an appearance. He gives his full approval to Stephen's stoning, and we see great persecution break out against the church in Jerusalem. And it's Saul whose anger, which is intensifying towards the church, begins to destroy the church by whatever means possible. Going from house to house, dragging men and women and putting them in prison. This meant that the church had to get mobile and quickly. In chapter 8, we see the church reaching out more widely and getting moving to avoid the intense persecution of its day. And the church is scattered. Philip leaves Jerusalem rapidly following the death of Stephen. But he is certainly not in hiding. He was one of the 7 deacons appointed in Acts 6 to make sure that the widows were receiving food. But now we find him here preaching, a budding evangelist, paving the way for many more to come. This wasn't just happening to Philip. Though persecution scattered the church, even to the 4 corners of the earth, it says, everywhere they went, they took the gospel with them. They were not running in fear and hoping not to be caught. No, the early church was determined to be wise, but always spread their message far and wide. The scattering of the Christians at this time led to a huge step forward for the mission of the church. The persecution they were facing in Jerusalem was the catalyst to spreading of the gospel and establishing the early church. As the Christians moved to new areas, they found an incredible openness to the gospel, with a huge response to the message. This is shown significantly in Samaria, where Philip is seeing incredible signs and wonders and a power response to the call for baptism accompanying this. The people were captivated by the message they were hearing and were paying really close attention to the message that was being shared. However, it can be so hard to leave what feels like a mountaintop time with the Lord. Most of us will happily walk away from a time in the valley. When everything seems to be going so well, it feels so natural to stay. We wonder sometimes if that's how it must have felt for Philip in Samaria. Things were going incredibly well for him. He was being used powerfully, and Jesus felt closer than ever. Why would he want to leave? Whatever it was actually like for him at that moment, Philip cannot stay where it is all going so wonderfully. He's given a clear and fresh commission. We are so challenged by his willingness to do so. He trusts the Lord enough to know that he doesn't know what's best for himself, but God does. We can only see part of the picture and not the whole thing, whilst the Lord is all-knowing and seeing. Often in our lives, we've had to trust God instead of our own desires. And even if it's taken years to see, spiritual hindsight has always shown that the Lord knows best. When Philip left Samaria, he found himself on the desert road that runs from Jerusalem to Gaza. From a hugely successful ministry in Samaria, he now finds himself in the middle of the desert. It's here he finds an Ethiopian eunuch who wanted to have the scriptures explained to him. Here we see Philip not just bringing his pre-prepared talk. He doesn't change the agenda to fit his own intentions, but he meets the eunuch where he is. Philip blows apart social conventions and barriers by welcoming a eunuch into the church. Something according to Jewish law was not allowed. The early church was making it clear through words and actions that the gospel was not just for the Jews or the privileged, not just for the educated or physically perfect, not just for those who fit in, or those from the right ethnic group, but that this Jesus died for all, and his gospel is a message for everyone with no exclusions. This was no ordinary eunuch that Philip was encountering. He was in the service of Candace, the Queen of Ethiopia. He was her treasurer, or in our terms today, her Chancellor of the Exchequer. Once Philip spoke to him, this man converted and baptised. He went on his way rejoicing, unable to keep this newfound joy to himself. As a result of all this, the eunuch then became the first person in history to take the gospel to the continent of Africa. Because Philip shared the gospel, he saved the Ethiopian, and he sent him back to save his nation. They go on their own separate ways, but are now both part of the same family and both carriers of the gospel. Philip moves north along the coast towards Gaza, preaching through all the towns until he reaches Caesarea. For many of us, as we think about Philip and many others in the early church, we can also be prevented from sharing our faith in the same way, because we just can't see how we can have the same impact. Low self-esteem or wrong self-image is currently posing a problem in today's church. The same Jesus is within us, and the same Holy Spirit empowers us today. If we think that we have nothing to offer, we need to be reminded of the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6. When you include women and men and children as well, we discover that there were somewhere between 11,000 and 15,000 hungry people in a field at lunchtime. Jesus asks where should they buy bread, and no one knows what to do, until a boy offers his lunch to Andrew, and he bravely takes it to Jesus. And we know the story where Jesus multiplies it and feeds them all until they're all satisfied, with 12 baskets left over. Jesus can take what we have to offer and do things with seemingly inadequate resources that we would never dream possible. With Jesus on our side, anything can happen. Here is a boy with 5 small loaves and 2 fishes. But how far will this go amongst so many? Andrew can't understand how this small offering will help, but despite his lack of spiritual awareness, he still knows enough to bring it to Jesus. He acknowledges that the packed lunch before him is not adequate to feed all these people, not even one hungry man. But he is working with Jesus, who works wonders, so he takes it along to the king. As a result, Jesus feeds the whole field with plenty to spare. Andrew is probably as surprised as the rest, but he is beginning to realise that Jesus can take what seems like small efforts to us and use them in incredible ways. In much the same way, he can take what we have and make it go so much further than we think. The worst thing that we can do is keep what we have to ourselves because we don't think it's worth much. We're not sure Philip thought he was the answer to all the eunuch's problems, but he did know who was and pointed the eunuch to Jesus. In much the same way, we need to realise our worth and play our part. Today's session is Unleash Potential, and the word potential means having or showing the ability to develop into something in the future, or abilities that may be developed and lead to future success. In both meanings of the word, it means to develop into something. We as Christians all have potential. Our words and our actions carry potential. We may not think that the small actions or words that we speak to others make a difference, but God can take what we do and what we say, however small, and develop it into something that can impact a person's life, or even a community, or beyond. Philip did not realise the potential in the conversation he had with the eunuch, but God took the words that he spoke, and as a result, the continent of Africa heard the gospel. So it's of paramount importance that we avoid comparing ourselves to others. There seems to be people who just tell amazing stories of leading people to Jesus on trains and in parks and all over the place. Such tales make the rest of us feel like we never quite live up to those standards. But let us be clear on something, we can't. In their book Unleashed, Gavin and Anne Calver speak of a young girl who was feeling really discouraged, and she desperately wanted her 4 college friends to come to faith. but none of them were. However, as Gavin and Anne probed her with questions, it became clear that these 4 friends had all been really hostile towards Christianity a year or so earlier. And so now, as a result of this young woman, they were no longer hostile, although still disinterested. They told her that she should be delighted, as her friends are on a journey, and that she is positively influencing them for Christ, even if the progress may seem slow. We need to celebrate the impacts that we are making in the everyday. All of us today can bring our little to Jesus, and he will use it to help bring others towards him. When we look at this example in Acts chapter 8, we can ask these questions. Is it Philip who saves the eunuch's life? Is it Philip that brings the transformation? Is it Philip that changes the destiny of this man's life? Is it Philip that walks this man from death into life? No, it's Jesus. And what we are called to do is to be in those spaces, to name drop Jesus, and to open up the possibility for God to do what only God can do. We see all through Acts the disciples and the early believers' willingness to share in words and also in practical ways, serving each other and their communities. God worked through them. They accomplished nothing on their own, but God used their words and actions and grew his church. The same applies to us today. We can't save anybody. We can't transform a person's life. We can't bring anybody to faith. But each of us can be used, and God can use us to still grow the church today. Right now, it's difficult to make plans or to know how to plan for the future. Even to make plans as a church and to commence ministries. We may feel limited with the current restrictions, but each and every day is packed with potential. Being unleashed starts with a willingness on our part to speak and act in a Christ-like way and reach out with words of truth and comfort, reaching out into an individual's situation and needs and meeting them where they are. And as we go and do this, we can go into each day knowing God is with us. God can use what we bring, what little we bring, and develop it further. If we choose not to act, then the potential in our words and actions lies dormant and unrealised. Potential lies within them. And when we act, it opens up possibilities for God to work in someone's life. If we take an acorn, for example, if it remains unplanted, it will never become a mighty oak tree. However, the potential to be a mighty oak tree lies within the acorn. For that to grow, it has to be planted and then watered. In the same way, there is potential within you and I. God is waiting for us to be willing and listen to his promptings, and when we act, however small that may be, it releases potential, and God can then have the ability to develop it further and into something greater. The final encouragement is to seek to do this knowing God is with us. This promise is throughout Scripture and should help us to be brave. The promise remains with us, and as a result we can follow him where he leads, share his message with those different to us, bring our own little to him, and be comforted by his unwavering presence. We need to be released from self-doubt, fear, inadequacy, and unleash our words and actions and our potential, our little that we have, which God can develop into something wonderful. We can only see the now, but remember God sees the full picture. And as we are unleashed, our words and actions release potential, where God can work and move in people's lives.
Your church